While a lot of people were focusing on the COVID outbreak this week, a record high number of Chinese warplanes entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone.
A top China military expert at Stanford University, Oriana Skylar Mastro, tells us why she thinks China could attack Taiwan within 2 years.
Also, a Taiwanese company is looking to get emergency use authorization for its COVID vaccine. We'll tell you how the local standards compare with the US, the EU, and the WHO.
And in Hashtag Taiwan, Leslie tells us about another pandemic hero. This is Taiwan Insider. This past week, for the first time, peace in the Taiwan Strait and China's growing military power was highlighted by the Group of Seven, or G7, and by NATO as U.S. President Joe Biden took his first trip to Europe to strengthen the Western alliance. Perhaps not by coincidence, on Tuesday, Taiwan saw a record high number of Chinese warplanes enter its air defense identification zone. Let's take a look.
On June 15th, 28 Chinese warplanes made an incursion into southeastern Taiwan's air defense identification zone. That's the most Chinese planes to enter the zone since April 12th, when 25 Chinese planes flew close to Taiwan. The U.S.'s Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group entered the South China Sea on Monday, and some specialists say that's why China is ramping up its presence in the region. One expert says China, which claims Taiwan as part of its territory, is trying to send a message. Over the past few months, U.S. President Joe Biden has met with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga and Korean President Moon Jae-in. Maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait was a primary talking point at both of those meetings. Earlier this week, the G7 summit also published a statement which once again underscored the importance of peace in the Taiwan region. Military experts say that the Chinese government is having none of it, and its maneuvers around Taiwan show that. They say that Beijing feels threatened, and that's why it's flexing its might near Taiwan. Air Force Deputy Commander Zhang Yanting says that China's actions put pressure on Taiwan's eastern air defenses. He says that Taiwan's Air Force still has room for improvement. For example, Taiwan's missile defenses need upgrading if it is to successfully fend off an attack.
Now, China's gray zone warfare on Taiwan is a global threat. I recently spoke with a top China military expert at Stanford University, Oriana Skylar Mastro. She recently wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine about why she believes Beijing could attack Taiwan soon. She is also a strategic planner for the United States Air Force Reserve. She recently testified to the U.S. Congress that she believes China could attack Taiwan within 2 years. I asked her why she thinks so.
I think a lot of the wisdom that China would never want to risk a war with the United States is somewhat outdated. China, of course, of the 1990s, when we had the third Taiwan Strait crisis, and the United States sailed 2 aircraft battle groups in the vicinity of the Taiwan Strait, China backed down. But that was largely because it did not have the military power to persevere, and it also didn't have the economic and political power to protect itself from costs of use of force. That's no longer the case. China has basically embarked on a foreign policy strategy to ensure that countries, for the most part, would stay out of a Taiwan issue. And they've embarked on a very impressive military reform campaign, which for a component of it ended in 2020. And so now they do have the ability to take Taiwan by force. So this, coupled with Xi Jinping's statements, which suggests that he would like to resolve the issue sooner rather than later, points to a change, in my mind, of China's emphasis away from peaceful reunification towards a policy of armed reunification.
I also asked her what the U.S. and its allies could do to deter China.
Well, we get into some maybe technical details, but one of the first things the United States needs to do is have more land-based missiles, probably in the second island chain. So a lot of people think that if the war is costly for China, they won't do it. I disagree with that. I think if China gets Taiwan, even if it costs them their Navy, they're willing to take that risk. And so I really think we need to focus on developing military capabilities designed to physically stop the Chinese from sailing across the strait. So something like having missile capabilities that you could saturate the strait with missiles would be sufficient to stop that type of amphibious landing. So that's where I think initially the focus should be. But I do think that if Xi Jinping thought that an attack on Taiwan could threaten China's rejuvenation, for example, if he thought that U.S. allies and partners would cut off trade ties indefinitely with Beijing if they attacked Taiwan, he wouldn't do it. Right? China's trade, over 60% of it depends on the United States and its allies. The problem is that China has basically set up a foreign policy strategy to convince other countries that Taiwan is a unique case. How China treats Taiwan should not be taken as indicative of, what type of country China is. And so I think a lot of people within the Chinese government think, for the most part, countries will stay out. So we have to be able to signal that, no, the world after an attack on Taiwan will not be favorable towards Beijing.
Now, what would a U.S.-China war over Taiwan look like? Well, this is what Mastro said.
It completely depends on the scenario. So the U.S. military is far superior to the Chinese military, but wars are not won and lost on that alone. The nearest part of the Taiwan Strait is 80 miles, right? China could possibly get to Taiwan, occupy Taiwan, sign a peace treaty with the government of Taiwan before the United States even gets there. And then it's going to be very difficult for a U.S. president to fire on China if no war is currently ongoing. If for whatever reason, the United States gets adequate warning, is able to amass forces in the region, or if the war becomes protracted in some way, then, I think the United States has the advantage. But Chinese strategists also know that. And that's why they're primarily designing campaigns for quick fait accompli victories.
Wow. And what do you imagine that to look like?
So some Chinese sources have put that in a number of hours, that they could take complete control of Taiwan in 100 hours. I've seen in some Chinese sources. There was a RAND war game that estimated it more in a number of days, or at the high end, a number of weeks. But when it comes to planning major military operations, that's relatively quick, and it could be a lot longer before the United States can actually physically come to Taiwan's aid. And that's why it's so important that Taiwan is able to defend itself. I don't think anyone has the expectation that Taiwan can defeat the PRC. The question is, how long can Taiwan hold out to give the United States time to come to its aid? And even small increments, like an extra week or two, could be the difference between victory and defeat.
So you think that the U.S. would come to Taiwan to defend if China attacks? I think that's what we hear about most of the time.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that's something, the big question is, if we have enough time to do what's necessary to achieve our goals. But, a lot of people who argue otherwise, it might also be a generational thing. The U.S. military of today, these are people who have volunteered and signed up, that have a vision of the world that they're willing to sacrifice their lives to protect. This isn't, Vietnam era America. And so I do see very strong morale and very strong willingness in the United States to do, what is right. And so I have full confidence that my country would come to the aid of Taiwan and to other allies and partners in the region. The question is, how costly is that going to be?
Now, we talked in depth about the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. The whole interview is on Facebook and YouTube. Now, Taiwan's Air Force has not only been busy intercepting Chinese warplanes, it's also dealing with an outbreak.
For the first time in 71 years, Taiwan's Air Force Combatant Command is going into lockdown. That's to make sure the base can maintain combat readiness. More than 300 Chinese warplanes have breached Taiwan's air defense identification zone between January and June this year. The Combatant Command is responsible for tracking and intercepting would-be attackers. Now, with 6 staff members at the Air Force Combatant Command infected with COVID-19, officials are worried that if the virus spreads, it could compromise Taiwan's air defenses. The Air Force has set up a reserve command center in case primary command falters. Taiwan's Air Force says it's taking every step to maintain its integrity. People coming in and out of the facility are carefully tracked, and strict controls are in place to keep COVID-19 out of the command center. Air Force Command says that its protocols are in line with the Central Epidemic Command Center's guidelines. Anyone entering the Reserve Command Center will need to produce a negative COVID-19 PCR test result taken within the 3 previous days. A specialist from the Taiwan Strategy Research Association says that it's important for the military to adapt in the face of new challenges. Whether it's microscopic droplets or 30-ton bombers, Taiwan's Air Force is ready to fend off all airborne attacks.
Taiwan could have its first local vaccine by later this summer. That's if it gets emergency use authorization. Now, some people say they're concerned because the drug made by Medigen has only passed phase 2 trials. So how does Taiwan's process for authorization compare to other countries? Staś Butler reports.
A year and a half after the COVID-19 pandemic began, and the world already has a number of vaccines to prevent the disease. In fact, there are precisely 17. That's the number of vaccines approved for use in at least one country somewhere in the world, according to McGill University's COVID-19 vaccine tracker. The decision to approve a medicine for emergency use is based on one thing: do the benefits outweigh the risks? But there are no countries that have authorized all of those 17 vaccines, which tells us one thing: approval standards vary. So what does it take to get a vaccine authorized? To keep things short, we'll look at the process in 3 organizations: the US Food and Drug Administration, the European Medicines Agency, and the World Health Organization. Then we'll look at Taiwan. First up is the US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. The vaccines they've currently authorized for emergency use are Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. The FDA's guidelines are fairly explicit. They want to see some results from a phase 3 trial. That can be interim analysis from midway through phase 3, at least 2 months after participants have been fully vaccinated. How about the European Medicines Agency? Well, they've authorized the same vaccines as the US FDA, plus AstraZeneca. And they're a little less explicit about trial phases, but the results are pretty much the same. The agency says it wants results on efficacy, and at the moment, the only widely accepted way of doing that is through phase 3 trials. And the agency wants those trials to have at least 30,000 participants. That brings us to the World Health Organization, or WHO. Technically, the organization doesn't grant EUAs, but instead EULs, emergency use listings. Get one of those, and the WHO might distribute your vaccine as part of Vaccine Initiative COVAX. The WHO actually says phase 2B trials can be enough, but it does want data on efficacy. That said, the WHO does leave the door open for other ways of showing efficacy in the future, not just phase 3 trials. And that's using this thing: an immune correlate of protection. Which brings us nicely onto Taiwan. Taiwan's FDA says vaccines should prove they are as good or better than the AstraZeneca vaccine through a process called immunobridging. And what does that mean? Well, the idea is this: when you get vaccinated, your body reacts and produces antibodies. In theory, at least, the more antibodies you make, the more you're protected against the disease. So Taiwan is going to compare antibody levels in people who took the local vaccine, made by Medigen, and the AstraZeneca vaccine. Then, they'll use that to try and figure out how effective the Taiwanese vaccine will be. Now, the reason they're doing that is because running phase 3 trials is becoming more and more difficult as the world gets more vaccines. Part of the reason is because a lot of people would rather get an authorized vaccine than take part in a trial for one with unknown efficacy. That's why researchers around the world have been working on finding ways like this to get vaccines approved without slow and expensive phase 3 trials. So, does the amount of antibodies correlate to protection from the virus? Well, at least one scientific paper suggests for COVID it does, but the WHO has not yet drawn a conclusion. They say the data isn't clear enough yet. So as for Medigen's vaccine, it remains to be seen whether Taiwanese authorities are ahead of the curve or jumping the gun.
Again, that was Taiwan Insider's Staś Butler, and of course this is a very important story, so we'll be following that and bringing you updates. Up next, #Taiwan.
This is Jiayongjie, actress, model, show host, triathlete, and mother of 3. If you're thinking, wow, it sounds like she can do it all, then you'd be correct. Taiwan's internet has recently given her another title, Queen of Prevention. Jia first ticked on my radar earlier this week when news surfaced that she assembled prominent public figures for a charity drive to donate 342 high-flow nasal cannulas, otherwise known as HFNCs, to hospitals all around Taipei and New Taipei City. What's an HFNC? Well, it turns out that they're actually a pretty big deal. They're high-end ventilators that are vital for fighting serious cases of COVID-19. Most notably, the machines allow COVID-19 patients with serious cases to eat, and they lower the risk of disease transmission to medical staff. Jia said she received a message from a friend saying medical staff desperately need HFNCs. The message says that public hospitals have trouble getting their hands on the machines because of complicated bidding processes. So Jia reached out to distributors in Taiwan and organized a drive to raise money to purchase the machines. Each one of the machines cost around $9,000, which puts the value of Jia's donation at around $3 million. That's a lot of cheddar, but that's not where this story ends. It wasn't until that I read up on this story further that I realized just how deep this thing goes. The HFNCs are just a small part of a massive campaign to donate goods to medical workers. Jiayongjie has been at it since June 1st, and by at it, I mean she's been coordinating donations to hospitals. The donations come in the form of equipment or food, and they're often sponsored by other public figures or businesses in Taiwan. For example, this is what her organization did on June 14th, which was Dragon Boat Festival, a national holiday. That day, her organization donated 70 of the 342 promised HFNCs to hospitals all around Taipei. At 4 p.m., they delivered snacks to Taipei Runai Hospital. At 11 p.m., they donated snacks to Taiwan Adventist Hospital. At 11:30 p.m., they donated more snacks to Cathay General Hospital. Then, at 12 a.m., they donated even more snacks to McKay Memorial Hospital. Jia said that medical workers don't get a break for Dragon Boat Festival, so there's no reason why she should get one either. She goes into detail about the 4 p.m. delivery at Runai Hospital. Actress Alice Ko helped deliver goods. She donated 250 pastries, while actress Vivian Xu sponsored 100 boxed meals. And a few restaurants also donated coffee and even more food. And that's just contributions to one hospital on one day. Personally, I am overwhelmed by Jia's generosity. She publishes updates about her donations on Facebook, showing which businesses and public figures donated their time and money. Jia isn't the only one making a difference. Taiwanese model Ling Ziling donated 6 mobile COVID-19 testing booths, while the band Mayday donated 66 oxygenators to help fight the disease. For the first time ever, the words star power have given me pause. Just knowing that entertainers and public figures are out there using their money and influence for such a great cause and on such a massive scale makes me think about what I can do for frontline medical workers. And I know that if it's making me feel this way, then I'm not the only one.
Before we leave you today, let's take a look at some of the other stories on our radar.
Taiwan's COVID-19 outbreak is slowing down. The R number, or reproduction number, has dropped to 0.46. That means that each infected person is infecting less than one other person. In mid-May, Taiwan was reporting over 500 new cases each day, but recently there's been a string of days with fewer than 200 new cases. Epidemiologist Dr. Chen Xiuxi even says that Taiwan could see its level 3 alert restrictions loosen up soon. Taiwan and the US say they are committed to restarting trade talks under the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA. The two sides signed the agreement in 1994, but have not used it to hold talks since 2016. Senior citizens aged 75 and over can now get a COVID-19 jab in Taiwan. Given the limited supply of vaccine doses, some local governments are giving priority to those 80 and over. A number of venues have adopted a system developed in Japan in which senior citizens stay seated while medical staff move around vaccinating them.
All right, final question of the day. What is one thing you miss about life before the level 3 restrictions began on May 15th? Andrew.
All right, the one thing I would miss is chilling, and I'm talking about sitting down with friends without masks on, maybe having a drink, and just chatting.
I do too. Leslie?
All right, guys, without a doubt, I miss my friends, all right? My pals, my amigos, my tomodachis. And I still keep in touch with them over the phone, but it's just not the same when you can go out and hang out with them. And you realize how easy it is to be starved for social interaction when the most words you let out in a day is at your TV. So when we get out of this level 3 alert, I can't wait to get together with my friends.
Me too. And I also miss swimming. I would love to go for a swim right now. Thanks for tuning in to Taiwan Insider. I am Natalie Tso.
I'm Andrew Ryan. Take care, guys.
And I'm Leslie Liao, reminding you to drink water.
Be sure to follow us on social media and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. See you next week.